Bijan Robinson is likely headed to the Pro Bowl games this year, but will any other Falcon be joining him?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, part of Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network on the planet, which means it's number one in the galaxy. I am your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. In today's episode, we will be talking about which Falcons could be headed to the Pro Bowl this year with the final day of voting being upon us as I record this. Who's deserving, who isn't. We'll get updates on Mike Hughes and Drake London's injury status moving forward. What does that mean for the Falcons at cornerback for these final 3 games? And what is potentially the timetable for Drake London's potential return? But today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. If you want to be right in the middle of the action this season, visit FanDuel.com and place your NFL live bets all season long. So jumping into the Pro Bowl conversation, as I mentioned earlier, Monday, as I'm recording this, December 15th, is the last day of fan voting. As you guys may or may not know, fans account for 1/3 of the Pro Bowl votes. Players and coaches account for the other 2/3. And in terms of players that are on the Atlanta Falcons that are deserving of making the Pro Bowl, you know, the one guy that you absolutely got to pound the table for is Bijan Robinson. He has had an outstanding season, you know, got off to a brilliant start this year. And, you know, through the month of September, we were talking about him potentially, you know, being in the running for Offensive Player of the Year. Things started to cool off a little bit, but you've started to see him kind of bounce back, but still one of the top running backs in the NFC with guys like Christian McCaffrey and Jahmyr Gibbs. And my expectation with 3 guys headed to the Pro Bowl games from each conference, you know, Bijan will be one of those 3. We'll talk a little bit later about where he and other players rank in the fan voting and why that's indicative of why some of these guys could wind up making it. But in terms of other players in the mix, right? You know, I feel like Bijan's pretty self-evident, as we often joke on this podcast. You know, there are 2 types of people on the planet: people that are fans of Bijan Robinson and people who haven't watched him yet. I don't feel like I have to convince anybody who's watching this show why Bijan is deserving of being in the Pro Bowl. But there are other players that may be on the cusp of being the Pro Bowl this year. And I'll basically share my thoughts on whether I would personally put them on my own personal ballot as opposed to yours. And obviously I would love to hear your feedback on why you think some of these players are more deserving or less deserving than I'm going to indicate on today's episode in the comments and elsewhere. But, you know, I think the other player that you could say definitely has played at a Pro Bowl level this year for the Falcons is Drake London. I think the one knock on Drake London in terms of his Pro Bowl bid is the fact that he has been battling injuries. He's been in and out of the lineup, but when he's been on the field, he has absolutely been one of the 5 best wide receivers in football when you look at some of the statistical production that he's been able to put up as kind of a one-man wrecking crew for this Falcons passing offense. But I do think the injuries are going to potentially hold him back. And, you know, a lot of times with the Pro Bowl voting stuff, it's kind of the volume that gets you in. And when you miss a significant chunk of games, you know, that's going to be a problem. We'll talk later on today's episode if Drake is going to miss even more games moving forward, which seems likely at this point in time. The other player that typically automatically gets a bid is Chris Lindstrom. I don't necessarily know if I would put Chris Lindstrom on my Pro Bowl ballot. You know, he's still grading out really highly according to PFF. I think he's like the 2nd highest graded guard in the NFL this year. But it's been kind of a down year from my assessment with Chris Lindstrom. He's still playing good football, don't get me wrong, but it's been more like a 7 out of 10 year than like the 9 out of 10 year that we have grown accustomed to with Chris Lindstrom over the last, 4 or 5 years or however many it's been. And some of that's owed to the injury. Some of that is owed to a big dip in pass blocking and without his usual running mate with Caleb McGarry, you haven't seen, you've seen certainly some outstanding classic Chris Lindstrom moments as a run blocker, but it just hasn't been as consistent as it has been in the past working with Elijah Wilkinson. But, I think a lot of people would say, the fact that he doesn't have his usual running mate in Caleb McGarry at right tackle means that what Chris Lindstrom is doing, and when he does play well, is actually more valuable than it would be otherwise. But the other player on offense that I think you could make a case for is potentially Kyle Pitts, kind of for the opposite reason with Drake London, where if Drake London is going to miss the Pro Bowl because he's missed too many games, you can make the case that Kyle Pitts could make the Pro Bowl because other tight ends are in that same boat with Drake London and have missed too many games. Guys like George Kittle, Sam Laporta, Tucker Kraft, all those guys have missed a roughly the same amount of games that Drake London has missed so far this year. Arguably, I think all the three of those guys in terms of NFC tight ends have had better seasons than Kyle Pitts. But like you kind of put Kyle Pitts, Trey McBride's clearly going to make the Pro Bowl as one of the two tight ends, I believe, that make the Pro Bowl for each conference. But you can make the case because Kyle Pitts has been more available than some of these other tight ends, as TE5, I guess you could say, in the NFC, that he may be deserving of being in the mix there. So we'll see on that front. I'm not going to necessarily really make a strong case, but it's just sort of how that dynamic works, where it's like, oh, he's been healthy and that's why he makes the Pro Bowl, as opposed to it's because he's one of the two or three best tight ends in the conference. Now, flipping to the defensive side of the ball, I don't know if there's a single player on the Falcons defense that I feel like I would pound the table for making the Pro Bowl. I think there are certain guys that are kind of borderline. I know James Pearce, with the recent surge in sack production, will probably get a lot of people's love in terms of Pro Bowl voting this late in the season. I wouldn't look at James Pearce's entire body of work and say like that's a Pro Bowl player, but certainly you like seeing the sack production overall. Again, I know people are going to sit here and say I'm biased, but it's the interesting thing about James Pearce, and I don't say this to knock him. I'm just trying to make the point clear that this is not me just being a hater or anything like that. But the sack production is definitely valuable. And I think really the thing I'll say is it makes you feel great about where James Pearce is, his upward trajectory in the league. But he's third on the team in pressure rate over the last 7 games when he's been getting all those sacks, 8 sacks and 7 sacks in the last 7 games or whatever it is. But he's third on the team, not in the league, third on the team in pressure rate over that span, and second in the team in win rate. So even though he's getting all the sack production, which again, no one's knocking him for that, it's hard to sit here and say that he's definitively the best pass rusher on his team. So it's hard to say he's one of the 3 or 4 best edge rushers in the conference if he's not even the best guy on his team, even with him playing as well as he is. Kaden Ellis, probably earlier in the season when he was kind of leading the team, in my opinion, in terms of pass rush production, you probably could have made a case. But then I think with Divine Diablo's injury, his play dipped. And I think he's kind of bounced back, but he hasn't been really the force as a pass rusher since midway through the season that he was in previous years. And that's really the case for Kaden Ellis as a Pro Bowler. I think Kaden Ellis is underrated at the other linebacker skills, but he's not like a Pro Bowl caliber linebacker when it comes to doing all the other things that you want a linebacker. He's really a Pro Bowl caliber guy based off the pass rush production. And I would probably say for the first 6 or 7 games, he was on a Pro Bowl pace, but it's kind of cooled off since then. AJ Terrell, I thought, has played some of his best football this season until the last 2 weeks. And maybe that recency bias is going to knock him out of being Pro Bowl consideration. I don't know if I would have pounded the table for him based off of how he played prior to that of being a Pro Bowl player, but he was kind of one of those borderline guys that I think if you're watching the tape, you're really impressed by him. But the PFF grades are not going to do him any favors in that regard. Jessie Bates and Xavier Watson, I think both have been solid this year. I think Bates, to a certain degree, has been underrated because he hasn't gotten quite the ball production that people expect from him. And so I think people look at his performance this year more negatively. And I think you could say the opposite is true. Not to say that Watts is overrated, but I think people look at the ball production and go oh, wow, he's playing great. But, we know how that works with safeties. If you get a lot of interceptions, you're going to get a lot of love. We saw that last year with Kirby Joseph with 9 interceptions, and he got the love deservingly. But Xavier McKinney as well over Jessie Bates and whatnot. But because of how the voting works, we'll see how these guys get. The voting works you don't vote by conference anymore. You're just basically picking 6 guys at each position group, and then whoever the top vote getters are after the fan votes are tallied and the player and coaches votes are tallies, is what decides it. And so I'm sure there's a little bit more nuance to it and whatnot. But looking at the top 10 players in terms of fan voting as of Monday morning, we got this released Monday morning, and there are 6 Falcons in the top 10 at their respective position groups. Xavier Watts is 6th overall, 4th in the NFC. Punter Bradley Pinion is 3rd overall, 2nd in the NFC. Kaden Ellis, inside linebacker, is 4th overall, 4th in the NFC. Brandon Dorlus is 8th among D tackles overall, 5th in the NFC. Bijan is 4th overall, 3rd in the NFC. And Kyle Pitts is 8th overall, 4th in the NFC. Interesting enough, Chris Lindstrom is not in the top 10 of guard voting, but he also wasn't in the top 10 of guard voting amongst fans last year going into the final day either, and still wound up making the Pro Bowl largely due to the players and coaches. So I could see that happening again this year if they're not necessarily knocking him for the subpar season. I don't think they're watching as closely as I am in terms of Falcons film for other players and coaches and whatnot. So I would guess at this point in time, Bijan should be a lock. We'll have a episode about Pro Bowl snubs if Bijan does not get in. And then I don't know if we'll really talk about anybody else, but my guess would be Lindstrom will probably be the second likeliest player to make the Pro Bowl based off of where the fan voting is right now. I'm not expecting the players and coaches overwhelmingly to give the love to Bradley Pinion and Xavier Watts and Kaden Ellis and Brandon Dorlus and Kyle Pitts to push them over the hump and whatnot, like the fans are going to do. So we'll see on that front, but we will continue today's episode talking more about, injury updates with Mike Hughes, and with Mike Hughes not being out or not being able to play this week against Arizona. Who will step into his role? Is that going to be Kobe Bryant? Is it going to be Natron Brooks? Is it going to be CJ Henderson? We'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. We know the NFL Sundays move fast, one big play, and suddenly everything feels different. And that's what makes live betting with FanDuel so exciting. You can place bets on FanDuel as the action unfolds, every drive, every momentum swing, every highlight moment, because the live spreads and money lines adjust instantly. Player props go up and update as guys heat up, and those are the options that you can do with FanDuel. Or you can just bet the straight up spread with the Falcons. They're 2.5 point favorites on the road this week against the Arizona Cardinals. Last time they were road favorites was against the Jets. They didn't take care of business, but the last 2 times they've been road underdogs against the Saints and Bucks, they've been able to take care of business. So that probably suggests that you should probably bet on the Cardinals this week to cover Jacoby Brissett versus Kirk Cousins. But whatever you want to do, all you got to do is head on over to FanDuel and get a piece of this action and place your NFL live bets all season long. FanDuel, the game moves fast, and so can you. Now, before we continue today's episode, I want to thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast. You are the reason why Locked On Podcast Network is the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy, and especially for you everydayers that want to really flex your muscles, you can join the Everydayer Club that Locked On is now launching. For $5 a month or $50 a year, you can get exclusive access to an ad-free version of Locked On Falcons, as well as exclusive access to a Discord server for various other Locked On shows. And you can get access to a merch store, so you can get your Locked On merch as well. And you can do so by heading over to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. So we got an update on Mike Hughes' status for this upcoming game. He has already been declared out with an ankle sprain for the Arizona Cardinals. I told the Locked On Falcons insiders earlier today on Monday that the fact that they're declaring him out this early in the week usually indicates that this is not going to be just a 1-week injury. This is usually a serious multi-week injury. And so there's a possibility that we find out later this week, depending on how it goes, that, Mike Hughes could potentially be shut down for the rest of the season. But at least initially, Raheem labeled it week to week, but did indicate that he'll be getting more information on that and meeting with doctors, I think later on Monday, to get more clarity on this, the exact severity, of the injury. Now, Mike Hughes, if he's done for this year, will almost certainly be back in 2026 due to having his 2026 salary fully guaranteed. It's been a tough year for Mike Hughes in 2025, where I thought he was relatively solid in September. He did give up a number of big plays early in the season, but overall I think was solid. But really starting in that 49ers game where, it felt like the 49ers were really going after him in that game. And pretty much every team since then has been going after that CB2, whether it's been Mike Hughes, whether it's been Natron Brooks, whether it's been Keith Taylor, whether it's been Kobe Bryant, in large part, as we've said many times on this podcast, as well as Falcon Squad shows, his quarterbacks are looking at the field. It's like, I could throw at AJ Terrell, or I could throw at whoever is on the opposite side. And quarterbacks have overwhelmingly been throwing at the guy on the opposite side. And obviously a big part of that has been Mike Hughes. Now, one of the things I'm going to be giving the Locked on Falcons insiders an update with the extended all 22 review is my charting in terms of pass coverage, and looking at the numbers earlier today. He's been a little bit more effective in man coverage than you would probably assume, just watching the games. It's really zone where he's struggled in terms of coverage. Obviously, the Falcons play a lot of match zone, so it's very similar to man coverage. But he has currently the lowest success rate allowed based off my charting among cornerbacks in man coverage. Now, that's not necessarily because he's locking things down, but a lot of it is quarterbacks are just missing throws when they throw at Mike Hughes in man coverage, as opposed to him like breaking up passes and really having that lockdown man coverage. But, the big question with Mike Hughes being out at least for one game, we'll see how his status is for the remaining 2 games of the season after this Cardinals game, is going to be who's going to step in this week. And so the options are going to be Kobe Bryant, Natron Brooks, and possibly CJ Henderson. I guess you could throw Keith Taylor in the mix. Bryant obviously stepped in this past week against Tampa Bay for Mike Hughes. And so my guess is that he'll probably be the first man up. But if the Falcons look at the film, as they could, and be like, you know what, we weren't that impressed with Kobe Bryant, maybe that prompts them to give CJ Henderson a look. But either way, whoever's going to suit up for Mike Hughes, as I suggested earlier, is going to see a lot of targets in all likelihood this week. We'll see if the Falcons choose to saddle Marvin Harrison with AJ Terrell. I believe Michael Wilson is the number 2 wide receiver for the Cardinals. I haven't sat down and watched Cardinals film yet, guys. I usually do that on Wednesday ahead of the crossover. So I'm not as up on my Arizona Cardinals film as I should be. And so that assessment is based off of 6 weeks ago or whatever it was. But we'll see what the Falcons wind up doing. Now, I think, you can make a case for the Falcons probably playing Kobe Bryant first, because we know that the cornerback position is going to be a priority need for the Falcons heading into this offseason, right? We've discussed before how the Falcons chose to punt on the outside cornerback position this offseason, even though it was a priority need this past offseason, as the Falcons often do, and that has been a consistent trend under Terry Fontenot, their current GM, where they always look at whatever is the big option, big piece. They focus all their attention, double dipping, quarterback, edge rusher on that position, and kind of ignore other areas, as they ignored edge rusher in 2024, ignored cornerback in 2025. And it's one of the reasons why I do not think Terry Fontenot is deserving of being the general manager of this team moving forward. But, he'll look a little bit better if Kobe Bryant is able to step in for Mike Hughes and be that quote unquote 8th round pick that Terry labeled him as after the draft, as an undrafted free agent, and play well. And so they'll be like, well, we were able to find a draftable player in, the 8th round, and we got a 4th or 5th round talent in that round. And you saw Kobe Bryant show that over the final 3 games, even if he didn't show it necessarily in the Tampa Bay game. And that will allow Terry Fontenot to save a little bit of face, much to my chagrin, but I'm sure to at least 40% of the fan bases, they want to keep Terry. So we're not going to go on a rant today about that. But I think that probably is what the move the Falcons will do, but we'll see. They kind of need to figure out if they have at least a body to come in already on this roster to come in and challenge Mike Hughes when he's coming back, or to potentially leapfrog Mike Hughes as a starter, in addition to upgrading that position this offseason. So we'll see if they find that this week against Arizona. When subsequent weeks against the Rams, that Rams game is going to be a challenge. I know Devontae Adams is dealing with a hamstring pull, I think, and whatnot. But that's going to be the real challenge, is can you cover Adams or Nakua? Will go a long way to, helping Terry save a little face on that Monday night game. So we'll see on that front. But speaking of that Monday night game, that feels like likely to be the game. If Drake London's going to return, that's going to be the game. But we got an update on Drake London. We'll talk about whether or not he will be suiting up anytime soon. And should the Falcons, could they do it all over again? Should they have put him on IR? We'll break all of that down, guys, to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Today's Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Rocket Money. Especially this time of year, it does feel like your money just kind of disappears. Now, obviously, during the holiday season, you're spending on gifts and whatnot, but throughout the entire year, it feels like money just disappears, right? You get a few subscriptions here and impulse buy there, and then you're looking at your bank account and you're like, this doesn't match the numbers that I have in my head. And Rocket Money is going to help give you clarity, track every dollar, and stay in control of your finances, because managing your money shouldn't feel like a second job. Rocket Money does all the heavy lifting for you so you can save more and stress less. They will find subscriptions that you forgot that you were paying and help you clean them up quickly. Their bill alerts and spending notifications will also help you catch the small things before they turn into big expenses. So take control of your finances and cancel your unwanted subscriptions with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon, rocketmoney.com/lockedon. So we got an update on Drake London, or a quasi update, as much of an update as you can get from Raheem Morris. He said that Drake London is day-to-day, remains day-to-day, but Raheem said he's hopeful that he's coming back. Again, we can't really put too much stock in that based off of Raheem's track record when it comes to reporting injuries. And, sometimes his hopes mean that, that player is going to be back this week, and sometimes that means that player is going to miss another 3 weeks. We never know. And so we'll just have to wait and see. And that's kind of the story with Drake London and a lot of these injuries. But we'll just kind of wait and see where his status is later this week in practice. Hopefully he'll be limited in practice later this week, which means he's at least trending in the right direction, because he hasn't been able to practice for at least the last 4 games. Excuse me. But given the nature of his PCL sprain, I'm not particularly optimistic that we will see Drake London at least against this Arizona Cardinals team later this week. As I mentioned, when he suffered that injury in the Week 11 Carolina game, or after he suffered that injury in the Week 11 Carolina game, that he was probably going to miss 6 weeks. And with 7 games left, I said then, excuse me, that it's a real possibility that Drake London has played his last snap for the Atlanta Falcons in the 2025 season in that Carolina game. And that was based off of injuries, that PCL sprains that Ricky Pearsall with the 49ers and Brock Bowers with the Raiders suffered earlier this season that caused them to basically miss 6 weeks. Pearsall was labeled a mild sprain, which the expectation was he'll miss 1 or 2 games. He missed 6 games. Brock Bowers, battled through his PCL sprain for 3 games, really struggled. Then the Raiders kind of shut him down for 3+ weeks, 4 weeks, if you count the bye week, before he was able to return. And so, again, it begs the question of, knowing all that information, should the Falcons have put him on IR initially? And, I've been asked by Locked On Falcons insiders, why didn't they put him on IR, as well as people in the Locked On Falcons Discord. And so I'll just share my thoughts on that. I think there's 2 reasons, right? The first reason is that PCL sprains tend to be very nebulous, right? As I mentioned, mild sprains, in theory, you're only going to miss 1 or 2 weeks. Moderate sprains, you miss 3 to 6 weeks, right? But we've seen examples, as I mentioned, with Pearsall and Bowers, relatively mild sprains that lingered longer than that. You go back to last year, Puka Nacua suffered a PCL sprain early in the season, was put on IR by the Rams for 5 games before coming back. But part of the reason why he went on IR, because he had dealt with a PCL injury earlier that summer in training camp. And so they just basically, we're going to shut you down for a month plus before we bring you back. And he was able to come back strong. Christian McCaffrey was obviously dealing with a lot of injuries last year, but the final one that shut him down for the season was a partial tear of the PCL ligament, right? And that shut him down for the final 5 games of his season and whatnot. And so, it's why I sat here thinking like, oh yeah, Drake's going to miss probably more than this is not going to be like a 1 or 2 week injury just based off of that. And so that's one of the reasons, my natural pessimism plus, this recent data suggests that it was not going to be a 1 or 2 week injury for Drake London. when the Falcons initially said he'll miss at least a week. That was basically all they said. And now we're 4 games later. The second reason why I don't think the Falcons put him on IR is because you just got to look at where the Falcons were when he suffered that injury. They were trying to battle back from a 3-8 start the season. And even if you sat there and the doctor said like there's only a 2% chance that Drake London is going to be back within 4 weeks, the Falcons would have said that's 2% good. That's good enough for us to leave that door open, leave that door cracked by not shutting him down for 4 games, because we need him at some point in the next 4 games to win games, because we're trying to save jobs. And now that, we're sitting here 4 games later, it feels like it's too late now to put him on IR. So you might as well just ride it out for the rest of the season. Not to mention, it's not like you're really dying for a roster spot at this point in time where it's like, oh, well, we need to bring somebody up from the practice squad to help us out at, the Falcons are currently carrying like 12 receivers, I think, right now, if you count the practice squad as well on their roster. So, they have a lot of bodies at this point in time. So, they don't really necessarily need the roster spot at this point. So, obviously I'm not necessarily an expert on this. And obviously the team doctors should be the experts on this. Raheem is definitely not an expert on this, but I sit here kind of more optimistic that Drake won't play this week against Cardinals, but may play against the Rams, just because it's a Monday night game. You get an extra day of rest to get ready and whatnot. And so we'll keep an eye on Drake's status in practice this week. If he's practicing on a limited basis by the end of the week, I feel like that Rams game becomes a real possibility. I feel less optimistic about him being the Cardinals, but I love to be wrong, right? I love to be wrong and have him be limited on Wednesday and Thursday and then fully participate on Friday, or, be limited and be questionable and actually play, be a game time decision or something like that. So we'll see. But as I indicated earlier, because of past history, I'm not expecting Drake to be back at least for 6, until that 6th game, which will be the Rams game. And if he misses that game, then we'll see if he's available for that Saints game and whatnot. But in the meantime, we'll just have to ride it out with Kyle Pitts and Darnell Mooney and David Sills. All right. All these pass catchers that, if the Falcons make a regime change, which we think they will, none of these guys will be here in 2026. So, a lot of these skill players other than Bijan and Drake are not going to be here until you're like, Charlie Warner, you're going to be here. I hope Charlie Warner's going to be here. But it's like Bijan, Charlie Warner, that's about it. Michael Penix, I guess, but he's not playing. So we'll see. So not a whole lot when it comes to this offense of being like, oh, these are guys that are getting valuable reps for next season. It's like the defense is getting that, but the offense is just like, yeah, all these guys are auditioning for other teams at this point in time. So, we'll see how those auditions go. We'll keep you covered here on Locked On Falcons. Thank you for making us your first listen. You can check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts if you want to continue to do so. Tomorrow, we should be joined by either Josh Kendall or Charles McDonald. Charles McDonald of Yahoo Sports, Josh Kendall of The Athletic, to talk about the situation in Atlanta. Both of those episodes should be dropping at some point this week. I don't know which one is going to be dropping tomorrow versus later in the week. We'll see. We'll play it by ear because I haven't had the conversations, and obviously whichever one I feel is more topical will get published first, and then the other one will wait, possibly, Wednesday afternoon or later in the week. We'll see. So continue to make us your first listen. Check out Locked On NFL as your second listen. And of course, make sure you check out the Everydayer Club for $5 a month or $50 a year. You'll get all Locked On Falcons shows ad-free, exclusive access to a Locked On Discord merch store for Locked On, and exclusive access to the Locked On Sports Today, the Locked On National Show. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.